Lasagne. Ok. Sì, come no, certo. Eh? Hello, welcome and welcome back to Room Lasagne. Next stop is Minimalism in Software Development by Fredrik Haard.
Thank you. I normally speak more about technology and how you can hack stuff, but there's one single piece of more like philosophical outlook that I really feel strongly about in software development today, and I will talk about that. I will not talk about agile, although I think that this is a quote that every engineer should be able to sign up behind, that the art of maximizing the amount of work not done is really, really important. And a while ago, a couple of years ago, I'm a consultant, and I sat at my work, and I was getting increasingly frustrated with no real discernible reason. And then I realized that I don't get as much work done as I believe I should. I mean, I have a pretty high opinion of myself, and I'm able to knock that code out real quick, but I just couldn't get the work done, not fast enough. Everything took a very long time to do. And looking around, of course, the reason was right there in my face. I was working at a website, which had a web shop. So a website with a web shop, company website, web shop. This website had over 400,000 rows of Java code and over 30,000 rows of XML to configure all that. Now, I would argue that there are very, very few home pages on planet Earth that would need 400,000 rows of code. Would anyone care to disagree? No. So the root cause of the fact that I couldn't get work done was actually not the problem domain, it was accidental complexity. And this doesn't work anymore. Okay. And accidental complexity, if you haven't heard the term before, is simply any complexity that does not arise from the problem domain, but does arise from the solution domain, or the way we choose to solve our problems. So most of the questions on Stack Overflow, for example, is about how do I configure this framework? That's accidental complexity. That has nothing to do with the requirements for a product or the customer's requirements of what they want. It has everything to do that I chose to use this tool, and now I don't know how to use it, or it's really, really complex, or really, really hard to do what I want to do in this tool. And most problems that we do solve in our day jobs doing software development have a fairly low essential complexity. That is, it's not rocket science, most of the stuff we do. So most of the complexity we find in our work today, I would argue, is actually accidental complexity. And we're getting so used to it that we see it as a natural thing that the problem solving I do at work has nothing to do with what the customer wants. It has everything to do with making the tools work. And I mean, that's insane. We're actually spending our time fighting against our own tools instead of fighting for what whoever pays our bills wants us to do. And we do this because we're lazy. Any good programmer is lazy. But it's also really easy to get a convenient start, to get an easy start on a project, instead of looking at how can we make this simple. I would advise anyone to see one of Rich Hickey's videos on easy versus simple, for example. We do stuff that's easy for us to do, and when we do that, we very, very often end up with a very complex solution, which will, of course, down the road, not be very easy to maintain. And I'll continue for just a little bit with the original problem. This is a high-level overview of the Spring framework, which I was working in at the time. And of course, we also used J2EE and about 250 other libraries and frameworks. Very little of this, any single project, will use very, very few of the components available here. This is made to solve any problem for anyone. And any tool that tries to make that will become complex. If they're really, really good, it might not be that complicated, but it still will be complex. And you will still have to find what you need in this mess, really. And the problem is that you have taken somebody else's generic solution to all of your problems, and then you try to make them work for you. And I wouldn't say that you should always reinvent the wheel, but you just maybe not outsource the steering of your car or something. Because that's what the framework does. You don't use the framework. The framework uses you, and you get to tell it what to do in some of the details. And another problem with solutions like this, and I'll not continue bashing on Java for very long, is that this happens. If there's somewhere in this stack trace, and it's abbreviated, you can see here's 17 more, 23 more. So this is not all of it. If there's somewhere here is a piece of my code, I can probably fix it. This can, however, be the result of a misconfiguration as well. And in that case, I just hope that one of my colleagues has seen this before and solved it, or I can find the answer on Stack Overflow, because there's just no way that any documentation in the world, no matter how good, will help me with this. It's just not, because the root cause will be like a null pointer deep, deep, deep in the Spring code. And lest you think that everything in Python is better, this is Django stack trace. Yeah, it's actually shorter. It's better. So, yeah, this is a much better tasting kind of poo, as a colleague of mine would put it. And I guess that the original trace, for somebody who really knows Django like a Django developer, it would be trivial to solve this. The problem is, most people wouldn't choose Django because they are Django developers. They would choose Django because they want that website up fast for their startup, as Angelo said. And when this happens, they have no idea of how to fix it. And since they have no idea how their own application stack actually works, it's really, really hard to work around the problem. If you get a stack trace when you've done it yourself, you either know it, you're sitting beside the guy who knows it, or at least the stack trace is very, very seldom this long, because you've made a specific solution to your specific problems, which normally does not give this kind of stack traces. And I would argue that there isn't a solution to build better, huge frameworks. And again, to return what Angelo said at the end of the lightning talks, it's to take smaller pieces and put them together. Because any single product that tries to solve all of your problems, if you just make a framework to solve the problems of all the people in this room, it will be a mess. Because for all of us, there will be a lot of stuff in this mega framework that will not have anything to do with your problems. And that's a problem, because as long as it works, sure, you don't have to use those parts. Yeah, and as long as it works, fine. But when I have to start digging, when I have to start digging through the documentation or the source code or the stack trace, then I care about it, even if I don't use it. Because that complexity will bite me. And there's no way of getting around it. Above a certain size, the cost of trying to understand any framework will be higher than the benefits you're actually getting out of it. And we'll move on to this really, really great quote by Jeff Apple. I don't know why anyone would still be using XML except for being forced for it by circumstances. Django doesn't, I think, so that's good. A lot of frameworks does. A lot of configuration is done, and the problem with XML is exactly the same as with large frameworks. It's made to be able to represent any data at all. You should be able to put anything in there and it should just work. Well, it should work after some twiddling. And the problem is it ends up being bad at representing everything. It can do it, but it's not good at it. And if you ever try to write an XML parser, you know that XML parsing isn't actually that easy. The XML grammar is like insane and redundant. And if you try to parse, as a human being, try to parse XML, because that was one of the goals, right? It should be parsable by humans and computers. But this is mostly noise to the computer and to the human. If I had asked the question, get stock price, and I got the answer 34.5, that would have been enough for me. The rest of this is just noise. I should probably have made the calculation of how many percent noise this is, but it's a lot. And there are, you do need structured document formats for transferring information sometimes, perhaps, and there are others to choose from. And a lot of the time, you can actually transmit data in binary in some way. It's not that dangerous. If you do expose interfaces to the world, for the world to use, yes, having an XML interface maybe is a good idea because a lot of people will use it. Not having an XML interface and telling them to use your beautiful new interface that uses some other format might be even better. But a lot of the data we do send with XML is actually internal data. I control both sides. So I take my binary data here, transform it into XML, send it over the wire, which is also, all of this noise gets sent over the wire, and then I deserialize it here and get it into binary. That does not make sense. And that's because a lot of the easy tools to use do this. So instead of looking at the problem and see how we can solve it, we look at the tools and say, yeah, I can use lots of those tools. And I would argue that is the wrong way to go about it. You should look at the problem and see what's the smallest possible amount of tools, of code, of effort I can expend to make this work. And you can't just say it's really, really easy to plug in those libraries. You have to actually think of how much complexity will I be pulling in. And even if you do love XML, if anybody ever does that, it's a document format. Seriously. It's made for documents. And there are places where XML is used with flow control constructs like JSF and so on. And that's just don't. There's no reason to do that. We have programming languages to do that kind of stuff. It's okay to use them. And this quote is about Hibernate. I could set in any ORM there. This is from Kristen Gorman. You should see the video, which is really hard to see on the screen. And she makes the point that Hibernate is like a cake mix. You're not doing it yourself, you're just taking something off the shelf and like mixing it together and, oh, look, I have a product. And it's very much the same thing. If you use a cake mix, you have no idea what you actually put in there. All of the, additives that are probably bad for you, and an extra helping of sugar to make it good. And it's very much the same thing with ORMs and going back to frameworks. If you don't understand your problem well enough to solve it, maybe you need to learn how to solve the problem before just mixing and matching instead. And one of the problems with ORMs, as I see it, is that we've become used to solving the problem of how do we put an object graph or objects into a database by translating them into a relational model. And don't get me wrong, relational databases are great at what they do and should not in any way be replaced for those things. But representing object graphs or objects in a database just would fit better, maybe even in an object database or document database. Or as some of us learned yesterday, you can do NoSQL in Postgre and you can have both of them. And that's great. And you don't actually have to do this whole translation thing. And the translation is fine if you're only doing it once. I mean, you make your model and then bam, it works and you will never ever look at it again. And it might even work if you're only changing it from the top up or bottom down. Well, the other way around, of course. And only do it the same way every time. But I'd say that any non-trivial application I've seen using this does not end with just generating the schema. They generate the schema and then they do have to do some hacks on it to make it work just the way they want. For small applications, fine, it works. When you start to do something special, what do you do when you need to regenerate the schema? When you have made custom changes to the previously generated schema? You have to handle it in some way. There are lots of bad ways of doing it. I haven't found a good one yet. You can let it change the schema, and then you go back and do the twiddling again. And if you ever forget that, just everything will break. Or you can not do the changes to the schema and accept a trade-off in your product because of the way the platform you chose works. So you go and tell whoever wanted that product that, yeah, you're not getting exactly what you wanted because I don't want to do that. Or I can't do that. Or I'm too lazy to do that. In fact, I've been in the situation where customers have come with perfectly okay requirements, and I've been forced to say that, though, that's really expensive. And they say it should be simple. And yeah, it should be. It should be really, really simple to do that. But unfortunately, the tools we chose to use 3 years ago doesn't think that we should be able to do that, or didn't think of our case. And it irks me that all of this comes from some kind of fear of like writing code and writing SQL. I mean, we are programmers, most of us. I do like programming, and I don't see it, or at least I no longer see it as my main mission to not program. And that's a lot of the discussions in the software community seems to be about how we can program as little as possible. And I wonder why anyone would become a programmer if that's their goal. I mean, if you just want to do administration and configuration, you could become a sysadmin instead, I guess. Well, they might have to do some scripting, of course, so maybe not. And this goes, of course, for web stuff and so on, but the ORMs are actually used for a lot more things. And it's, if your domain does not map into a relational model, why would you force it into a relational model? 10 years ago, you might have made the point that there were only high-performing relational databases, so you didn't have an alternative. And that was fine 10 years ago. Today, it just isn't. It's just an excuse not to have to do the work yourself. Right now, you will still be stuck with paying the interest rates, but you don't have to do it right now. And I've actually gone in on this one a bit. The fact is that this is what they tell us in school a database will look like, and then it will never ever change. And that's not true. Databases evolve. And the faster your product moves, the faster your database evolves. And the more auto-generation you have in that model, the harder it will get. It will not get easier. Because any sane product will not be totally auto-generated. If you could auto-generate your product, I hate to tell you this, but it's worthless. If a computer can do your job better than you, you're kind of a waste of space. So this will not be the truth. How many people have stuff like this in their documentation? This is what the database looks like. A few. How many have seen documentation like this? This is hopelessly out of date. Yeah, a lot more people. And that's because, I mean, this is an ideal model. If you're doing accounting, I guess you don't really change your models that fast. I might be wrong here. And getting everything correct and exact is like the most important thing you do. But for most of us, lining up rows and numbers isn't actually the core business. And we have seen on this conference how you can do multi-document transactions in MongoDB. We've seen how we can use PostgreSQL to store NoSQL data. So if our data does not map up to the relational model, maybe it's time to learn something new, perhaps, just a suggestion. And normally, this is where I would tell you to stop using Java and C# and start using some better programming languages. I figured that this crowd would not really be interested in switching from Java, right? So instead I'll talk a bit about this thing about reinventing the wheel. That's one of the things they really hammered into us during my university time. You should not reinvent the wheel. Not invented here is a curse. And do it yourself when you can do commercial off the shelf, that's just stupid. And yeah, they were academics. If you don't reinvent the wheel, this is the wheel you have. And if this is the only wheel you have, and you go out to build a car, should you reinvent the wheel, or should you just take whatever there and use it? Fact is that, I mean, the wheel has been reinvented time and time again. And that's not a bad thing. The fact that we solve old problems in new ways or in old ways but slightly more efficient. I mean, this is still recognizable as a wheel, and it's still a very long, long way from a racing car wheel. It hasn't been reinvented, but it has been improved on, perhaps. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, proper engineers who do stuff like wheels, not software engineers who mainly just sit around and drink coffee, they do reinvent all of the time. I mean, that's the only edge any company will ever have. That's the only edge any product will ever have, is doing stuff better. Once in a blue moon, you get a bright new invention. But mostly it's about building the same stuff we built before, but a little bit better, faster, smarter. And for a programmer, I'd say there's no better way to spend your time than to build a better wheel. If the wheel you can see is not good enough. And the thing is that this "don't reinvent the wheel" is so deep into the community that it's hard to tell people that, yeah, we could lift in all of those frameworks and stuff, and we would be up and running in a day. But what if we spend just a week and see what we really need to do instead? And that might not be as impressive for the customer who can see the website running and blinking and stuff on the first day. But it will pay down the road. And you won't have to tell your customers that, no, sorry, we took like 15 million shortcuts the first day, so you won't get what you're asking for. And I have been working in software projects of, I would say, all sizes. And I don't believe that there's such a thing as a project where you can't do it yourself. That's not to say that there are no good use cases for most tools available. But what you should do is question whether you need them or not. The right question at the start of a project isn't, what tools can I use for this? The right question would be, what tools do I absolutely need to do? There are things you shouldn't do yourself. I wouldn't re-implement a TCP stack for no reason. There are perfectly good libraries for that. I wouldn't write authentication myself because I know there are problems with doing that, such as I'm not very good at security. But the parts that are my core business, I would write them. And I would attempt to create a system that is the simplest possible, that solves the problem I'm setting out to solve. Because if you have a simple system, if you have a system of few moving parts, and that's not the same thing, you should hard code everything. Automate the curse word out of it. But as long as it's simple, as long as you know what every moving part does, it's really, really easy to keep on making changes. But as soon as you make it easy for yourself by picking other people's complexity into your domain, that ceases being easy. So you traded away your very freedom in your code for some convenience. And that's just not the way it should be. And to reiterate, I mean, the problem with frameworks are twofold. The first is that they call you, you don't call them. So you don't actually control the execution. That's why I like my frameworks as small as humanly possible, so the part of my software that I do not control is as small as possible. Whenever a library suffices to solve the problem, there's no reason to use a framework. Yeah. And when storing and transmitting data and so on, you don't always have to wrap it into something where it almost doesn't fit. I mean, binary worked for a long time. It still does kind of work. And you don't have to press every single homepage on the internet into a relational database. And of course, it's the main message I want to get across is that we are programmers. We should create stuff. We shouldn't assemble stuff. Not that there is something wrong with assembling if you can't actually solve the problem yourself. But if you can't solve the problem yourself, maybe you're out of your depth, or just maybe you should solve the problem in another way. If the only way you see to solve a problem is to take other people's generic solutions in every part, I'd argue you're an administrator of code. You're not a programmer. You're not a developer. And I believe that we should have a bit more pride than that. Because even though the customer is so happy when we get that prototype out of the door in like 5 minutes flat, and even though we won't actually be punished when the same customer gets shafted by our decisions 6 months down the road, it should be a matter of pride of us to write the best software we possibly can. And the way to do that is not to try more. It's to try harder to do less, really. And I'm a bit early, but I'm done.
Thank you very, very much. Been great, and we have also 10 minutes more or less for Q&A. If someone wants to ask a question? Anyone?
Yeah, it totally resonates, and it's definitely a hard balance to strike. And it's also true, as you say, it does not really make sense we cannot rewrite everything, and we obviously need to rely on lots of stuff already been there. But this probably parallels what happens in literature, where there was, I don't remember, Pascal or something, who said something like, sorry for not making this letter shorter, I did not have the time. So, yeah, I think that's what you were hinting. Oh, hello? Oh, yeah. Just really trying to have as less stuff around as you can. And obviously you cannot always avoid using other tools. But that's probably one of the main reasons we're here. We like a small expressive tool because we don't like the huge ones. So not really a question, but thanks.
Thank you. I'd say that that's actually a great quote, because often doing less takes more effort. I don't remember who it was who talked about hammock-driven coding. You think really hard. And I think that's the problem. We want to jump in and make stuff work. And it actually takes more work and more discipline to stand back and try to solve the problem with less real effort, but perhaps more mental effort.
So there is one more plus for using ready solutions that you are not mentioning and somehow sliding over. The thing is, if you are not the only developer on the team and you are using well-known tools, then other people immediately see what you are doing. And if you make your own custom solutions, then other people have to first learn your solutions to understand what is happening there. So this is also something to keep in mind.
Yes, that's very true. The thing I see there is that in the first part, when you do use generic solutions, you always end up, if the application is large enough that you actually need a lot of explanations, you always end up with special cases where you have tweaked it. And those parts are the parts that will bite anybody who believes that they know the framework because you have changed it. On the other hand, it's a very fair point. And for example, a point for example, using Django would be that it's pretty easy to, or comparatively easy to find developers who already knows the tools. On the other hand, you're stuck with only developers who does know the tool, and those developers have spent time learning that tool instead of honing their actual programming skills, which may or may not be a good thing for you. But I have not yet seen the problem that would actually force me to use one of the big frameworks. But I'm still quite young, so I might.
A quick question about...
Where?
Yeah. The thing is, when you use a framework, you're stuck, like you said, with a huge thing that could solve every single problem you could have or could not. But I'm talking about the client's reaction. When you say to the client, well, I'm using Django to build your website, he might know Django and know that you could rely on this, on the quality of the overall tool, of the overall framework. And if you say, this is an open question, what is the reaction of the typical reaction of your clients when you try to explain to them that you won't rely on a well-known and well-supported and documented project and tool because you like to writing your own custom code? Do they trust this attitude, or do they tend to say, well, if you could build it in Django, that would be better?
Yeah, that is a fair question, and customers do tend to ask you to use one of the 3 known frameworks. Even if they have no idea what they actually do, they trust the names and that they're widely used. So the times, I would say for new product, new contacts, new people, I would probably be hard-pressed to get the permission to do it myself. For somebody who actually does have an amount of familiarity with me and who trusts me, I would have to bet my reputation on that I can do this faster and quicker if I'm allowed to do it the way I want. And I will do that. So that is a problem. And I mean, you possibly shouldn't just turn down doing a project just because the client wants you to use a framework. In that case, you should do it in that framework as good as you possibly could, of course.
Actually, that's a direct response to what you were asking, because I wanted to bring as an example, we used to be a plone shop, and everything, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and we've recently done projects using a much smaller framework, which is called Pyramid, which is just an example. It could be any other smaller framework. And we figured out, actually, it's easier to, instead of finding somebody who does Plone and has this huge upfront knowledge, it's easier just to hire somebody who does Python and explain them Pyramid in an afternoon, and then they are productive. So that is an actual option, and I think we as a Python community are blessed with all these little frameworks that do very little but do that very well, and you take care of the rest, like a non-opinionated framework. So we have everything there. And also in answer to your question, the customer, indeed, they hired us because they wanted to do something in Python because they were used to do stuff in Java. And then the question of Django obviously came up, and basically that was the answer I gave them, is that it's easier to hire somebody. And now we actually have former Java programmers who have no Python experience working productively in the project, and this is like just 3 months in. So it is possible, and you can argue for it. And another thing you mentioned is like either it's this big massive framework that is well known and well documented. It's not exclusive. Like just to plug it again, Pyramid is like 100% covered in documentation, and it's, you can just give people the manual and they'll be able to be productive. So we have options.
So maybe I'm wrong, but I felt your attitude is a little bit radical. I mean, for me, doing less is balancing the two behavior, the two aspects. So using tools and reinventing the wheels. Because using tools, you can have accidental complexity, but reinventing the wheel, you can finish to code the wheel and not solve your problem. Am I right?
Yes, you're absolutely right that it is a balancing act. And I mean, you can be stuck reinventing the wheel while your business crashes and burns around you because you didn't get it out in time. So, so there are cases where, of course, you need to use whatever tools are available for you, and you will pay the interest rate, but at least you'll be there to pay the interest rate. So, I mean, that's why we get paid the big bucks, right? Because there are hard decisions to be made. And it is a balancing act. And if I come across as radical, I would say that I'm a moderate, but it's everybody else who's stock conservative.
Is there anyone else?
So
So I suppose we are also talking about terse code and like explicit, but at the same time precise and maybe a little defensive, but not verbose code. So I think while I like the idea of don't repeat yourself, since we are writing for humans and not for the computer, as we know, I like to think of don't repeat yourself as you wouldn't repeat yourself in a book or in a movie, and not like in a third normal form in a schema. Because we must not take much longer to explain things to a computer than we would take to explain to ourselves. And not much longer, but not even a lot less words and time. Or we end to make the same mistakes that some frameworks do, that where you define an object, an object structure in the model, and it generates the forms, and it generates the backend, and we write less code, but it's very troublesome in the long time.
A small remark. You being Swedish, this is absolutely pertinent. This, what you describe, I would call IKEA programming. It's like really simple manual, and you know what to do, but are you afraid that you're going to be left with a single piece you don't know what to do with, and like redo the entire thing because you forgot this little thing?
I will totally steal IKEA programming for the next time I do this spiel. And yes.
Anyone else?
The open source ecosystem is usually based on pieces of software that are reusable and generic and used by multiple people. Now, aren't you letting your pride get in the way of this whole mechanism? Contributing software, of sharing, of improving, of...
No, not at all, actually. I absolutely adore the way that the open source, and especially the Unix ecosystem works, where you have lots and lots of small programs or small libraries that do one thing and do them well. And there's no harm in reusing existing functionality. The harm is when you're actually modifying your solutions to fit into the tools instead of the problem, or when you lose control of how your application behaves, which is the point with frameworks. So I'm absolutely not, I mean, it's the best way to create programs, to create large programs, is to have multiple small programs and don't bother about writing the large one, I believe. So I'm not opposed to that at all. I'm all for.
All right. Thank you very much.